Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When my son got sick, I turned to my parents for help, thinking they'd be there for me like they always said they would. Instead, they told me they couldn't afford it. Days later, I found out they had just paid for my sister's luxury vacation. That was the moment I realized my family wasn't what I thought it was. It started on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, cold day where you can feel winter seeping into your bones. My son, Jacob, had been feeling off the night before, just a mild fever, I thought. But when I went to wake him up for school, he was burning up, his little body drenched in sweat. His cheeks were flushed red, and his breathing was shallow. Panic set in immediately. At first, I told myself it was just a stubborn bug. Kids get sick all the time, right? I gave him some fever reducer, made an appointment with his pediatrician, and tried to stay calm. But by the third day, when his fever hadn't budged and he could barely keep food down, I knew this was something more serious. The doctor confirmed it. Jacob needed specialized care, tests, and treatments that my basic insurance didn't fully cover. As the doctor explained the costs, my head spun. My bank account was already stretched to its limits. Between rent, groceries, and the endless expenses that come with being a single parent, I barely had enough to get through each month. I felt like the walls were closing in on me. I didn't have a choice. I had to ask for help. Calling my parents was a last resort. I hated the idea of relying on anyone, especially them. My relationship with them had always been complicated. But this wasn't about me. It was about Jacob. I called them that evening, sitting at the edge of my bed with the lights off, staring out the window at the street lights flickering below. My voice trembled as I explained the situation, fighting back tears. "Mom, Dad, I need help," I said, my throat tight. "Jacob's sick. The doctors say he needs treatments I can't afford." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough for my stomach to churn with anxiety. Finally, my dad sighed. "I'm sorry, honey," he said, his tone heavy. "But things are tight right now. We just don't have the extra money." His words felt like a punch to the gut. "Tight?" I asked, my voice rising. "Dad, this is your grandson. He needs this care. I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't serious." "I know," he said, almost sounding apologetic. "But you have to understand, we've had some big expenses lately. We can't just pull money out of thin air." I heard my mom in the background, murmuring something I couldn't make out. "We wish we could help," she added, her voice softer. "But maybe you can work something out with a hospital? Or a charity?" Their response left me stunned. This wasn't a shopping spree I needed help with. This was my son's health, their grandson's life. I tried to push down my anger and disappointment, reasoning that maybe they really didn't have the money. But deep down, a nagging doubt started to creep in. My parents weren't poor. They lived in a large house in the suburbs, went on regular vacations, and always seemed to have the latest gadgets and cars. I'd grown up hearing them talk about being financially comfortable. Still, I thanked them for listening and hung up, feeling more alone than I ever had. I sat there in the dark, tears streaming down my face, wondering how I was going to make this work. Jacob needed me to figure it out, and I would, but the realization that I couldn't count on my own parents left a hollow ache in my chest. Little did I know that phone call was just the beginning. What I would learn in the days that followed would completely shatter my trust in them and change the way I saw my family forever. For a few days after the call with my parents, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they really were struggling. Financial stress can hit anyone, right? I tried to push aside the nagging feeling in my gut, the one that told me something wasn't adding up. Then one afternoon, as I was scrolling through social media during a rare moment of downtime, I saw it. My sister, Lauren, had posted a series of photos from a luxury beach resort. In one, she and her boyfriend were lounging in a private cabana, tropical cocktails in hand. In another, she was posing by an infinity pool, the kind you only see in glossy travel magazines. The caption read, "Much needed R&R after a crazy few months. Thanks, Mom and Dad." I stared at the screen, my blood boiling. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. While I was scrambling to figure out how to pay for Jacob's treatments, my parents had apparently decided that Lauren deserved a fully funded vacation. I didn't have to dig far to find out where the money had come from. A mutual friend of ours, Susan, called me a day later to check in on Jacob. During the conversation, she casually mentioned, "Oh, I heard about the trip your parents sent Lauren on. They're so generous. She must have needed that break." "Wait," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "They sent her on that trip?" Susan hesitated, clearly realizing she'd stepped on a landmine. Yeah," she said cautiously. "Your mom was talking about it at book club last week. She said they wanted to reward Lauren for all her hard work." "Hard work?" My sister didn't even have a steady job. She spent most of her time hopping between hobbies. Yoga instructor 1 month, aspiring artist the next, always funded by our parents. Thanks for letting me know, I said tightly, hanging up before I could say something I'd regret. I couldn't let it slide. That evening, after Jacob was asleep, I called my parents again. This time, there was no trembling voice, no desperate plea. There was only anger. How could you? I demanded as soon as my mom picked up. Sarah, what's wrong? She asked, her voice laced with concern. Don't play dumb, Mom, I snapped. You said you couldn't help me with Jacob's medical bills because money was tight. But you just sent Lauren on a luxury vacation. How does that make any sense? There was a pause, long enough for me to hear my own heavy breathing. Finally, she said, Sarah, it's not what you think. Lauren has been so stressed lately, and she needed a break. Stressed? I repeated, my voice rising. Lauren is stressed? Mom, my son is sick. I needed your help to make sure he gets the care he needs, and you said you couldn't afford it. But you can afford to send Lauren to sip cocktails on a beach? It's not the same, she said, her tone defensive. You've always been so independent, Sarah. We thought you'd figure it out, like you always do. My jaw tightened. This isn't about me being independent. This is about your grandson. How could you prioritize a vacation over his health? It wasn't like that, she insisted, but her voice faltered. We didn't think it was that serious. You didn't think it was serious? I repeated, my voice shaking with fury. Did you even listen when I told you what the doctor said? Or were you too busy planning Lauren's spa treatments? The conversation didn't go anywhere after that. My mom kept repeating the same tired excuses. Lauren needed the trip. They didn't realize how bad things were for Jacob. They thought I'd be fine on my own. My dad chimed in once to say, it's not fair for you to compare your situation to Lauren's. You've always been able to handle things better than she has. I hung up feeling angrier and more betrayed than ever. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what the decision represented. A clear message that my parents didn't value me or my son as much as they valued my sister's comfort. That night, as I sat by Jacob's bedside, listening to his soft, labored breathing, I made a silent promise to myself. I would find a way to take care of him, no matter what, and I wouldn't rely on my parents for anything ever again. What hurt the most, though, was realizing that the family I thought I could depend on wasn't really family at all. Confronting my parents was supposed to be a turning point, a moment when they'd realize how deeply they'd hurt me and step up to make things right. Instead, it turned into a nightmare of defensiveness and excuses. We've done a lot for you over the years, my dad said, his voice firm, as though that somehow justified abandoning me when I needed them most. We can't help everyone all the time, Sarah. My mom chimed in, her tone softer, but no less dismissive. You're strong, honey. You've always been so capable. You'll figure this out, like you always do. Their words felt like a slap in the face. I wasn't asking for a handout. I was asking for their support for my son. My voice shook as I tried to explain that this wasn't something I could handle alone, that Jacob's health was at stake. But they didn't seem to hear me. It wasn't just the lack of financial help that stung. It was their complete disregard for the seriousness of the situation. Jacob wasn't just a name on a medical bill. He was their grandson, a little boy they claimed to love. Yet they had somehow convinced themselves that his health didn't warrant the same urgency as my sister's stress relief. I couldn't shake the image of Lauren lounging in a cabana, smiling for the camera while Jacob lay in bed, too weak to play with his toys. The contrast was almost too much to bear. You're really going to sit there and tell me that funding Lauren's vacation was more important than helping your grandson? I asked, my voice rising with frustration. Do you even realize how wrong that is? My mom sighed like I was the unreasonable one. This isn't about choosing sides, Sarah. We've supported you plenty in the past. Lauren needed this trip to reset. She's been going through a tough time. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And I'm not? My son is sick, Mom. Do you even care about that? Of course we care, my dad said, his tone clipped. But you've always been independent. We thought you'd handle it, like you always do. Those words echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended. The implication was clear. I didn't deserve their help because I'd never demanded it before. My independence, the very thing they'd praised me for my entire life, had now become their excuse to let me struggle alone. I walked away from that conversation feeling more alone than I ever had. It wasn't just the financial strain that weighed on me. It was the realization that my parents, the people who were supposed to be my safety net, didn't see me or Jacob as a priority. I spent that night by Jacob's bedside, watching his chest rise and fall as he slept. The steady rhythm of his breathing was a small comfort in an otherwise chaotic storm. I made a silent vow. I would do whatever it took to make sure he got the care he needed, but I would never again rely on my parents. Their choices had made one thing painfully clear. They weren't the people I thought they were. And while that realization hurt, it also freed me in a way. I didn't have to keep bending over backward to earn their approval or their love. I would focus on the people who truly mattered, Jacob and the small circle of friends who had shown me more kindness in a few weeks than my parents had in years. It was a hard pill to swallow, but it was one I needed to take. From that moment on, I stopped looking to them for anything. Not their money, not their support, not even their validation. They had made their priorities clear, and it was time for me to do the same. When my parents closed the door on me, I didn't have time to wallow in disappointment. Jacob didn't have the luxury of waiting while I licked my wounds. He needed me to fight for him, so that's exactly what I did. I started picking up extra shifts at work, anything my boss would give me. When that wasn't enough, I looked for side gigs, sewing, babysitting, even walking dogs for neighbors. Every spare moment was spent hustling. My evenings, once reserved for unwinding with Jacob after bedtime, were now dedicated to sewing custom orders or freelancing online. There were nights when I worked until the sun came up, caught an hour of sleep, and then started all over again. It was grueling, and there were moments when the exhaustion hit so hard I thought I might break. But every time I felt like giving up, I'd remind myself why I was doing this. Jacob's health, his future, depended on me. No one else was going to step up. What surprised me most during this time was how people I hadn't expected to care came forward to help. Friends who I hadn't seen in years sent small donations after hearing about Jacob's condition. My neighbor across the hall started leaving meals at my door, knowing I didn't have time to cook. Even one of my co-workers, someone I barely knew, offered to babysit Jacob when I needed to pick up a late shift. Their kindness was a lifeline, not just financially, but emotionally. It reminded me that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who show up for you when it matters most. One of my closest friends, Erica, became my rock during this time. She was there for the late-night phone calls when the stress felt unbearable and the hospital bills seemed endless. "You're doing an amazing job," she'd say, her voice steady with conviction. "Jacob's lucky to have you." Hearing those words from someone who truly meant them gave me the strength to keep going. Slowly but surely, I began to scrape together enough for Jacob's treatment. It wasn't a quick process. Every appointment, every test felt like another mountain to climb. But with each small victory, I started to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Jacob's strength amazed me. Even on his worst days, when he was too weak to get out of bed, he'd manage a small smile when I walked into the room. "I love you, Mama," he'd whisper, his voice barely audible but filled with so much trust and love that it broke my heart. Those moments made every sleepless night, every extra shift, worth it. The day Jacob's doctor told me his condition was improving was one of the happiest moments of my life. Watching him regain his energy, hearing his laugh echo through the apartment again, it was like a piece of my soul had been restored. My parents may have abandoned me when I needed them most, but I didn't let that stop me. I learned that I was stronger than I ever thought possible, and that the people who truly cared about me were the ones who stepped in when the chips were down. Jacob was getting better, and so was I. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were going to be okay. While I was scrambling to juggle work, medical bills, and sleepless nights, my sister Lauren's life seemed like a highlight reel. Every time I opened social media, there she was, posing at a fancy restaurant with a 5-star meal in front of her, lounging at a spa with her latest self-care essentials, or showing off her new car. It felt like she was living in a completely different universe, one untouched by responsibility or consequences. It didn't take long to figure out who was funding her lifestyle. My parents had always been generous with Lauren, but now it was as if they were competing to see who could spoil her the most. They paid for her rent, covered her car payments, and even bankrolled her latest passion projects, ceramics last month, photography the month before. Every time Lauren found a new calling, my parents were right there, gushing about her creativity and adventurous spirit. Meanwhile, I was barely keeping my head above water. What stung the most wasn't just the financial disparity, it was the emotional imbalance. My parents didn't just support Lauren with their wallets. They showered her with constant praise and attention. My mom's social media was a shrine to Lauren's achievements, filled with captions like, "So proud of my talented daughter," or "Look at my little adventurer, living her best life." When it came to me, their tone was completely different. On the rare occasions they mentioned me, it was always about how strong or independent I was, which felt more like a backhanded compliment than anything else. It was as if my struggles weren't worth celebrating because I didn't need their help, or more accurately, because they refused to give it. I couldn't understand it. I had always been the responsible one, the one who followed the rules, got good grades, and did everything I could to make them proud. Lauren, on the other hand, had always been the wild card, dropping out of college, bouncing between jobs, and relying on my parents to bail her out every time she hit a snag. Yet somehow, she was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. The disparity wasn't new, but it became impossible to ignore as I fought to keep Jacob healthy. While I was working double shifts and skipping meals to save money, Lauren was posting about her weekend getaways and her wellness journey. My parents' enabling wasn't just frustrating, it felt like a slap in the face. One night, I finally broke down and called Erica. I ranted about Lauren's lavish lifestyle, about how my parents had all the time and money in the world for her, but couldn't spare a dime, or even a kind word for me and Jacob. It's like nothing I do is good enough, I said, my voice shaking. I've worked so hard my whole life to be responsible, to be the daughter they could count on. And what do I get for it? Nothing. But Lauren, she screws up over and over again, and they treat her like she walks on water. Erica listened patiently, then said something that stopped me in my tracks. Maybe that's the problem, she said gently. You've always been the responsible one. They know you'll figure it out, so they don't feel the need to help you. Lauren, on the other hand, she's made herself someone they feel like they have to save. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had spent my entire life trying to earn my parents' approval, thinking that if I worked hard enough, they would finally see my worth. But maybe they already saw it. Maybe they saw me as someone who didn't need them, someone they could take for granted while they poured their attention into Lauren, who had built her identity around being helpless. It didn't make their behavior any less hurtful, but it gave me some clarity. For so long, I had been chasing something I could never reach, the same unconditional love and support my parents gave Lauren without question. I realized then that I needed to stop comparing myself to her. My worth wasn't tied to how my parents treated me, and it wasn't defined by how much praise or money they lavished on my sister. That night, as I tucked Jacob into bed, I looked at his small, peaceful face and felt a surge of determination. I didn't need my parents' approval or their support to be a good mother. Jacob didn't care about any of that. He just needed me to be there for him, to fight for him, and to love him unconditionally. And that was something I could do without anyone's permission. The breaking point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. I was at my parents' house, reluctantly stopping by to drop off some documents they'd asked for. Jacob was with Erica, who had kindly offered to watch him, so I could get some errands done. I had planned to get in and out quickly, avoiding any long conversations with my mom or dad. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard my mom's voice drifting from the kitchen. She was talking to one of her friends, a familiar voice I recognized from countless family gatherings. It's been hard on Sarah, my mom was saying. Jacob's illness has really taken a toll on her. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she was finally acknowledging the difficulty of what I'd been going through. Maybe she'd even expressed some regret for not helping more. But then she added, but you know, she chose this life. If she'd been more careful, maybe things wouldn't be so hard. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She chose this life. It wasn't just a lack of help. It was the blame, the way she casually dismissed my struggles, as if my son's illness was some kind of punishment for my choices, left me stunned. I stood frozen in the hallway, my mind racing. This wasn't just about the money they refused to give or the support they denied me. This was about how little they valued me as a person. They didn't just think I could handle things on my own. They thought I should have to. I couldn't let it go. After her friend left, I marched into the kitchen and confronted her. Is that really what you think of me, Mom? I asked, my voice shaking. That I somehow deserve all this because I chose this life. She looked startled and sighed. Sarah, I didn't mean it like that. I'm just being honest. You've always been so independent. I thought you'd prefer to handle this on your own. Handle it on my own? I repeated, my voice rising. Mom, I asked you for help. I told you I needed you, and you said no. Don't you dare act like this is what I wanted. Her face hardened, and for a moment, I saw the woman who had raised me, the one who believed that admitting fault was a sign of weakness. Look, Sarah, she said, crossing her arms. I know you're upset, but you've always figured things out. I didn't think you'd want us meddling. Meddling? I said, incredulous. This isn't about meddling, Mom. This is about your grandson. I wasn't asking you to fix everything. I was asking you to care. But instead, you prioritized Lauren's vacations and hobbies while I was fighting to save Jacob's life. She didn't respond right away, her eyes darting toward the window as if she couldn't bear to look at me. Finally, she said, I'm sorry if you feel like we've let you down. If you feel like we've let you down. Her words were hollow, empty of real remorse. They weren't an apology. They were a way to absolve herself without taking responsibility. It was then that I realized my parents weren't going to change. They had made their choice, and it wasn't me or my son. I left the house that day with a heaviness in my chest that no amount of fresh air could lift. The rain poured down as I walked to my car, but I barely noticed. My mind was replaying her words over and over again, each repetition cutting deeper. When I got home, Erica was sitting on the couch with Jacob, reading him a story. He looked up when I walked in, his little face lighting up with a smile. "Mama," he said, reaching out for me. I scooped him up and held him close, my tears finally spilling over. In that moment, I made a decision. I wouldn't waste any more time hoping for something my parents couldn't or wouldn't give me. They had shown me where their priorities lay, and it was time for me to make mine. My son deserved my energy, my love, and my focus. He deserved to grow up knowing that he was my world, even if the rest of the family couldn't see his worth. I would build a better life for us, without their help and without their approval. And I wouldn't look back. Making the decision to cut ties with my parents wasn't something I did lightly. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that stepping forward meant a free fall into the unknown. But after everything they'd said and done, or rather, everything they hadn't done, I realized I couldn't keep them in my life without sacrificing my own peace. I started by blocking them on social media. No more pictures of Lauren's extravagant lifestyle popping up on my feed, reminding me of their priorities. Then I stopped answering their calls. The voicemails came quickly after that, most of them from my mom. "Sarah, this is ridiculous," one of them began. "You're being so dramatic. We've always been there for you, and you know it. Call me when you're ready to talk like an adult." Others were more passive-aggressive. "I don't understand why you're doing this. Families fight, Sarah. That doesn't mean you shut people out. You're making things harder than they need to be." My dad's messages were more baffling than anything else. "Need help with your car?" he texted one afternoon, as if we hadn't just had a massive falling out. Another time, he sent a picture of a new barbecue grill he'd bought, with the caption, "Maybe we can use this together when you're ready to stop this nonsense." It was infuriating, but also painfully clear. They didn't see the problem. They genuinely believed that I was the issue, that my reaction to their choices was the real problem, not their choices themselves. For weeks, I wavered, wondering if I'd done the right thing. Cutting off your parents isn't easy, no matter how justified it feels. There were nights when I sat alone after Jacob had gone to bed, staring at my phone, tempted to unblock them just to see if they tried to reach out. But every time that doubt crept in, I'd remind myself of their dismissive words, their lack of support when I needed them most, and the way they'd prioritized Lauren's comfort over Jacob's health. As weeks turned into months, their attempts to contact me slowed. The voicemails stopped coming, and the texts became less frequent until they stopped altogether. It was as if they had given up, resigned to the fact that I wasn't coming back on their terms. It hurt more than I expected. Cutting ties felt like losing a limb, painful and disorienting. Even though I knew it was the right thing to do, I couldn't help but grieve the relationship I wished I'd had with them. I missed the idea of them, the version of my parents I'd always hoped they could be. But I couldn't keep pretending they cared about me and Jacob when their actions said otherwise. One night, as I was tucking Jacob in a bed, he looked up at me with his wide, innocent eyes and asked, "Mama, why don't we see Grandma and Grandpa anymore?" His question caught me off guard, but I kept my voice calm. "Because sometimes people don't treat us the way we deserve to be treated," I said gently. "And it's okay to take a step back when that happens." "Will they treat us better someday?" he asked, his voice small. I paused, unsure how to answer. "I hope so," I said finally. "But even if they don't, we'll be okay. We have each other, and that's all we need." As I kissed his forehead and turned off the light, I felt a weight lift off my chest. Cutting ties with my parents wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about protecting Jacob. He deserved to grow up surrounded by people who valued him, who saw his worth and loved him unconditionally. And if that meant letting go of my parents, then so be it. We were better off without them. It had been nearly a year since I'd cut ties with my parents, and in that time, I had worked hard to rebuild my life. Jacob was thriving. His health had improved significantly, and his laugh now filled our small apartment on a daily basis. I had found stability in my work, and had even started to feel a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. But there were still moments when the weight of my parents' absence crept in. It wasn't their company I missed, but the idea of what they could have been, what they should have been. Sometimes, I wondered if I had been too harsh, if maybe I had misunderstood their intentions or let my emotions cloud my judgment. That lingering doubt came to a head one day when I bumped into an old family friend, Mrs. Henderson, while grocery shopping. She had known my parents for years, ever since I was a child, and seeing her brought back a flood of memories. After exchanging pleasantries, she asked the inevitable question, "How are your parents doing? I haven't heard much about them lately." I hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But something in her kind eyes made me open up. "We're not really in contact anymore," I admitted. "Things got complicated. They weren't there for me when Jacob was sick, and I realized I couldn't keep them in my life." Her expression shifted to one of quiet understanding. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said softly. Then, after a pause, she added, "But you're not the only one they've done this to, you know." Her words caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Mrs. Henderson sighed and leaned in slightly, as if preparing to share a long-held secret. "Your dad's brother, your Uncle Richard, cut ties with him years ago. It was for similar reasons. Richard had some serious health issues, and instead of helping him, your parents spent their money on themselves. Vacations, new cars, fancy renovations, you name it." I stared at her, stunned. I had always known my parents could be selfish, but hearing about Uncle Richard's experience painted a bigger, more damning picture. "I had no idea," I said, shaking my head. "They never mentioned any of this." Mrs. Henderson nodded. "They wouldn't. Your dad didn't take it well when Richard called him out. They stopped talking after that, and I don't think they've spoken since." She went on to share more stories about my parents' history of playing favorites, not just with me and Lauren, but within their own families. She told me how my mom had always doted on her youngest sister, showering her with gifts while ignoring the needs of her older siblings. She recounted how my dad had been dismissive of another relative's financial struggles, claiming that people need to help themselves while indulging in luxuries that left no room for empathy. Hearing all of this didn't erase the pain of what they had done to me and Jacob, but it did help me see the pattern. Their behavior wasn't about me, it was about them. As I walked back to my car that afternoon, my thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated, knowing that my experience with my parents wasn't unique. It wasn't a reflection of my worth or something I had done wrong. It was simply who they were. But another part of me felt a deep sadness. It was one thing to realize that they had failed me, but knowing they had hurt others in the same way made it clear that this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a choice they had made, over and over again, to prioritize themselves at the expense of the people who loved them. When I got home, Jacob ran to greet me, his face lighting up as he wrapped his arms around my legs. "Mama, look, I drew you a picture," he said, holding up a crayon drawing of the two of us standing under a bright yellow sun. I knelt down to hug him, my heart swelling with gratitude. My parents might have let me down, but I wasn't going to repeat their mistakes. Jacob would grow up knowing he was loved, supported, and valued unconditionally. And for the first time, I felt a sense of closure. My parents' actions weren't about me. Their failure didn't define me. And their inability to show up for me and Jacob didn't mean I was any less worthy of love. It was their loss, not mine. In the months following my decision to cut ties with my parents, I found myself surrounded by a kind of support I hadn't expected. It didn't come from the people I was born into, but from the ones who had chosen to be there for me, and who I had chosen in return. Slowly, I began to understand what family really meant. Erica became the sister I never had. She showed up for every milestone, no matter how small, with her warm smile and unwavering encouragement. When Jacob took his first post-recovery steps, she was there, cheering as if he'd just won an Olympic medal. My neighbor, Mrs. Green, who had once been little more than a polite nod in the hallway, became my go-to for emergency babysitting. Even co-workers who had once been casual acquaintances stepped up in ways I never could have imagined, sending care packages, helping cover shifts when Jacob had doctor's appointments, and even inviting us to family gatherings. These people became my village, filling the gaps my parents had left behind. Their kindness wasn't conditional. It didn't come with strings or unspoken expectations. They showed up because they wanted to, and that made all the difference. Jacob grew stronger every day, his energy and laughter filling our small apartment with a joy that was impossible to ignore. Watching him heal felt like watching a miracle unfold. Every giggle, every messy crayon drawing, every bedtime story was a reminder of why I had fought so hard, and why I would do it all over again if I had to. We celebrated his 6th birthday in the park, surrounded by the friends who had become our chosen family. It wasn't a lavish affair, just homemade cupcakes, balloons, and a few games of tag, but it was perfect. Jacob's smile that day was brighter than any I'd ever seen, and as he hugged me tightly and said, "This is the best birthday ever, Mama," I felt a kind of contentment I hadn't known was possible. The life I was building wasn't perfect, but it was ours. It was filled with love, laughter, and moments of pure, unfiltered joy. As time went on, I found myself cherishing the little things that had once gone unnoticed. Game nights with friends became a cherished tradition, filled with laughter and the kind of camaraderie that felt like home. Baking cookies with Jacob on rainy afternoons, even when the kitchen ended up covered in flour, became one of my favorite ways to spend a day. I stopped focusing on what I had lost and started celebrating what I had gained. My parents' absence no longer felt like a gaping wound. It was a quiet reminder of what could have been, eclipsed by the overwhelming presence of the people who had chosen to stay. Family, I realized, isn't about biology. It's about showing up. It's about being there when it counts, offering support without expecting anything in return, and loving unconditionally. My parents had failed to do that, but the people in my life now had stepped up in ways I would never forget. I didn't need my parents to have a fulfilling life. I didn't need their validation or their approval. I had built something beautiful without them, and for the first time, I felt truly free. As Jacob and I curled up on the couch one evening, reading his favorite bedtime story for the 100th time, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And that, more than anything, was the life I wanted for us. Letting go of the anger I felt toward my parents wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow process, like untangling a knot that had been tied too tightly for too long. At first, the bitterness felt like armor, protecting me from the pain of their betrayal. But over time, I realized that carrying it around was only hurting me. Every time I thought about their choices, the way they had dismissed my struggles, prioritized my sister's comfort, and refused to show up when Jacob needed them most, I felt a surge of anger. But those feelings didn't change anything. My parents had made their decisions, and no amount of resentment would undo the damage they'd caused. So I made a decision of my own. I chose to let go, not for their sake, but for mine. It wasn't an easy process. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't always mean reconciliation. I didn't want to reconnect with my parents. They had shown me, time and again, that they couldn't be trusted to prioritize my well-being or Jacob's. Opening that door would only invite more heartache, and I wasn't willing to put myself, or my son, through that again. But letting go of the anger didn't mean letting them back in. It meant making peace with the situation, acknowledging that I had done everything I could to repair the relationship, and accepting that some things simply couldn't be fixed. For years, I had chased their approval, bending over backward to prove that I was worthy of their love and support. Letting go meant freeing myself from that need, from the endless cycle of trying to earn something they were unwilling to give. My parents made their choice, and I made mine. These days, my life looks nothing like I thought it would, but in many ways, it's better. Jacob is healthy, his laughter filling every corner of our home. Our days are filled with small moments of joy, morning pancakes, trips to the park, movie nights where we both fall asleep on the couch. The friends who became my family are still by my side, showing up for birthdays, holidays, and the quiet moments in between. They've taught me that love and support don't have to come from blood relatives. They come from the people who choose to stand by you, no matter what. For the first time in years, I feel free. Free from the expectations that held me back. Free from the pain of trying to fix a relationship that couldn't be fixed. And free to focus on the life I'm building instead of the one I lost. One evening, as Jacob and I watched the sunset from our tiny balcony, he turned to me and said, "Mama, I love our family." I felt tears sting my eyes as I smiled at him. "I love our family too, sweetheart," I said. And I meant it. In the end, I didn't need my parents to have a fulfilling life. I didn't need their approval, their money, or their validation. What I had, what Jacob and I had built together, was more than enough. My parents made their choice, and now I was finally at peace with mine.